And it's a text this morning that is, honestly, it's a story where someone ultimately ends up facing their fears. And as I started thinking about the idea of facing your fears, I was thinking about my relationship to the St. Louis Arch, the gateway to the West, you know what I'm talking about? And so when I was like 7 or 8 years old, my parents, we went on a trip to St. Louis, okay? And I'm from Springfield, Missouri. Like I hadn't gone up in the Hammond's Tower yet, and so like I'd never been up anything tall. And I was so excited because part of our trip, the last thing we were gonna do before we came home was we were gonna go up in the arch. And so like it was, it's the deal. I get to go up in a tall building, see St. Louis, and we get there, and the line to get into the arch is like 2 hours long. And it's like my dad's one of those guys where he just walked down there, saw the line, and was like, nope, and that's just kind of how it happened. And like it is okay. They had to work the next day, and we were going home afterwards, and so I was just like really bummed that I didn't get to go in the arch. And like what parents do in those situations where they're like, hey, we'll go back. 20 years later, I went to the arch. And I went, and like my whole life, like that 20 years, I always remember the time where I got to the arch, I didn't get to go up in it. Okay, so finally I go, I'm a youth pastor at this church at that time, and I'm taking like a group of students to the arch, because that's part of the thing we're doing in our retreat in St. Louis. And so I'm like, finally, after 20 years of waiting, I get to go in the arch. And so we're in line, getting ready to go up, that little elevator thing that brings it up. And several teenagers came up to me on that trip in that moment and said, I'm afraid to go up in the arch. Well, when you're getting paid to be there, you're the one that gets to sit out with the kids. And so I guess you can't make like, hey, volunteer who's giving up vacation time to be here. I've always, like, you can't do that. And so I'm like, okay, so I sit down there, and I got to walk around that awesome museum for an hour and a half. And so 7 years after that, my family, we do a St. Louis trip, and I'm like, we're going to the arch. And so we go. And we're sitting there, we go there, the sweet lady who's like doing the tickets to buy to go up in the arch, she's like, hey, today's probably not a good day to go up there. She's like, there's clouds and you won't be able to see anything. And I'm like, clouds don't go that low, we'll be fine. And so I'm like, no, we're gonna do it. So we go up the arch. She was right. I may or may not have gone up there. I couldn't see anything, but I did it. And here's the deal. I would have got to experience the arch in its fullness if some teenagers just would have faced their fears. But it's okay. I'm not bitter at all. And so as we come to our text this morning, it's a story where someone faces their fears, and that person is Jacob. And we've been looking at his life and the dysfunction of his life, and a lot of his dysfunction stems from his relationship with his brother Esau. And just to catch you up on the story, if you're unfamiliar, is that about 20 years before our text that we're going to look at in Genesis 33, Esau decided that he wanted to kill his brother. And the reason why Esau decided that he wanted to kill Jacob is because Jacob took things away from Esau that were very valuable to him. Things like his birthright, which would have been a financial thing that would have been very significant. And then not only that, but he also took away his blessing, which is like a spiritual thing that is also very significant. And so Esau, after all of this happens, Esau's response is, I'm going to kill him. Word gets to Jacob and Jacob's parents. And they're like, hey, Esau's nuts. Go 1,000 miles away. And so Jacob ends up going 1,000 miles away to the land of Haran. And after about 20 years, God speaks to Jacob, and he's like, Jacob, it's time for you to go home. It's time for you to go back to the land that I promised your grandfather Abraham that I was going to give to him. And as he's heading back to this land, he has to go through Esau's territory in order to get to the land. So Jacob does he's like, well, I better tell brother I'm back. And so he sends a caravan of 550 animals, kind of like hey, sorry, bro. And he sends it to him, and the only response that Esau gives Jacob is it says that Esau was coming to meet Jacob with 400 men with him. So Jacob thinks he's going to die, because his brother said he was going to do it 20 years prior. And right before this encounter, as they get ready to come to each other, where Jacob's going to have to face his fear, he has an encounter with God. And after he has this encounter with God, he feels more ready to face his brother. And that's where we'll pick up this morning in Genesis chapter 33, And we'll start in verse 1. It says this, and Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. He put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and then Rachel and Joseph last of all. And he himself went before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. And as I think about this, what's happening here as they're coming, 2 things come to my mind. One is, man, sin. Sin works its way through families. Like if you go what caused the dysfunction with Jacob and Esau? It was the fact that his parents showed favoritism. It was the fact that Esau was more loved by the dad and Rachel was more and Jacob was more loved by the mom. And it created all these problems. And here you have Jacob in this moment. And here's what he's showing. He is showing who his favorites are. He had his dysfunction, okay? Like we don't have time, but he had children with the servants. So he's like, I love them the least, they'll go first. Leah, you get behind them, and Rachel, you're in the back. And that's his way of saying, these are my favorites. And the thought behind it is, well, if the servants are attacked by Esau, Rachel and Joseph might be able to get away. Just think of how hard it would be to grow up being that child. And as you look at Joseph's story, you'll see that it is very much a lot of dysfunction that just keeps going. So think of that, and I'm like, man, it's amazing how we don't learn. And then I can't help but think, too, of the blessing. One of the things that Jacob took from Esau was the blessing. The spiritual rights of being in the home and, spiritual leadership of the family. And part of the prayer that Jacob stole from Esau was this prayer. It's in Genesis 27, verse 29. And this is what's prayed over Jacob. It says, let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons, Esau, bow down to you. That's prayed over Jacob. It's like what is going to happen in his life. Makes verse 3 seem really weird. Because what happens in verse 3 is you have Jacob bowing on the ground before his brothers 7 times. And it really makes you wonder, did God not answer that prayer? And what I believe it is that Jacob, because of his deception, he doesn't get to experience the joy of that blessing in his lifetime. But it's his descendants that will experience it, and the reason why they will experience it is because of the fact that he deceived his brother. And so you have this situation where all 7, everybody's coming up, and they're bowing before him, and they're doing this thing, and then as the text goes forward, you see kind of that flesh out even more. Look at this in verse 4. So there it goes before. It says, then Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, who are these with you? And Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Notice he doesn't mention the wives. He's like, I think he's a little embarrassed about that whole situation, how that went down. Then the servants drew near. They and their children, they bowed down. And Leah and her children drew near and bowed down. And last, Joseph and Rachel drew near and they bowed down. And Esau said, what do you mean by all of this company that I met? And Jacob answered, to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Jacob said, no, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Sometimes we do this thing in our heads where we make situations like way worse than they are, and then they happen and it's not as bad as we would think it would be. Like, I think that's kind of what's going on here with Jacob. He's like, Esau's going to kill me. And he's like, oh, no, we're just weeping and kissing. Like, I mean, that's what's going, like, so I guess we're good. And then you have this Esau character, okay? And there are parts of Esau here that look really, really commendable. One is you have his ability. I mean, albeit after 20 years, but he's able to overlook the offense of his brother. He doesn't bring it up. Even the sentiment in response to everything Jacob is offering him, which most commentators believe is Jacob's way of trying to like pay penance to his brother. His response is, dude, it's cool. I got enough. I don't need your 550 animals. They're yours, buddy. And so he doesn't want to accept. He doesn't want to make him pay, which is kind of interesting. And then you got like even just thinking about like putting yourself in Esau's shoes. Like Jacob left, and when Jacob left Esau, he left by himself with nothing. And now he's coming back wealthy with a limp. And he's got to wonder, what my brother is different. But what is worth noting, and as commendable as Esau might be for overlooking offense and letting a bygone be bygone, you can't look at this section and miss the fact that every time Jacob talks about something good in his life, he gives God credit. And Esau doesn't do the same thing. Now, it could be that Esau just, didn't think to. It could be that he had, but Jacob is so quick to acknowledge the supernatural and its working in its lives. And even at this point in the text, a question worth asking for all of us would be, who are we more like when good things come our way? Are we more like Jacob, or are we more like Esau? Are we really, really quick to be like, you know what, that came because God gave it to me? Or are we the type of people that are just kind of like, well, it's good. I have enough. And so you see that with Esau. And it's even like, you have this picture of Jacob, okay, at this point where he just seems like he's changed. Seems good. But then as the text goes forward, you see why he was given the name Jacob, which means deceiver or hill grasper. Look at verse 12. Then Esau said, let us journey on our way, and I will go on ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. That's interesting because they just traveled 1,000 miles. So maybe he's not being totally honest. And then he says, let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, at the pace of my children, until I come to my Lord in the land of Seir. So Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But Jacob responded and said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of that place is called Succoth. He's like, yeah, bro, I'll meet you there in Seir. I'll see you. Just go on ahead of me. I'll be there. And he doesn't go. He's still Jacob. He's still the deceiver. He's still unable to keep it. He kind of reminds me of that like non-committal friend, when you're like, hey, what if we got together on Friday? And they're like, yeah, that sounds great. Let me look at my calendar and get back to you. And they have no intention of looking at their calendar or getting back to you, but it's just like, or like when your kids are like, hey, what if we had ice cream tonight? And you're like, maybe. Like, it's like one of those, like, it's kind of what Jacob's doing there. He's like, yeah. And here's the thing, though, okay? Jacob shouldn't have gone to Seir. But he shouldn't have lied about where he was going either. I'll show you in form of a map, okay? So this is a map behind me, just kind of a picture of the promised land, okay? So that big, like, almost rectangle thing there, okay, that is the land of Canaan. That when God promised Abraham and he said, I'm going to give your descendants this land, he's talking about that rectangle thing, okay? Where Esau is he's outside of it. So if Jacob goes with Esau to Seir, he's walking away from God's promise. That's not where he's supposed to go, and Jacob knows that. He knows that he's supposed to go in the rectangle, not the square. And maybe he thought, I'll visit him someday, so I'm just going to tell him I'm going with him. Or maybe he was like, man, since he didn't kill me, I guess what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to confront him about the fact he's not living where he's supposed to live. I don't know. But he was right in not going. He was wrong in how he went about it. And as the text goes forward, you see that Jacob does end up in the land. Verse 18. It says, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money. That just sounds like someone who's never seen money before. I bought this candy bar for 3 pieces of money. It doesn't make sense. For 100 pieces of money, the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent, and there he erected an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. And so now Jacob is back. He's back in the land. Feels very much like Abraham, his grandfather, who also was given this promise that this land was going to be his. And even though God gave him this promise, he still has to purchase it. And what I think is so interesting is that even if you look at the text, the text refers to Jacob as Jacob. But when he experienced God and he encountered God in that wrestling match we looked at a few weeks ago, God changed his name to Israel. But the text is still calling him Jacob. But when Jacob names the altar, notice he names it based on the name that God has given him. So it just shows this picture of Jacob. And so this is our text. So the question is, okay, so what do you do with it? What do you do with this text? And I have 3 observations I want to make for us just as we take it home. And the first one is this, is that God's promises are trustworthy, but they don't always look like it. That God's promises are trustworthy, but they don't always look like it. I'd say it this way, the promise isn't the promise. The problem isn't the promise. The problem is how we view the promise. And even if you just think about this text or the 20 years leading up to this text, it really feels like God's promise to Abraham is at least somewhat in jeopardy. It's not, but it feels that way. I mean, just think about it. Okay, so for the last 20 years, there is one of Abraham's descendants living in the promised land. It's Isaac. He's almost 100, and he's basically blind. So he doesn't even know he's there. Okay, so you've got Isaac. He's the only one there. And then you've got Esau, who has decided, I am not going to dwell in the land of promise. And then you've got Jacob, who is 1,000 miles away from the land, living with this guy Laban, who is continuing to take advantage of him, and it seems like he's never going to make his way back. That if you were to just backtrack 15 years, you'd be like, how secure does it feel like God's going to do what he's going to do? I think you have to be like, man, I don't see how that's going to happen. It's not how I would do it. I mean, even just thinking about the promise that God made to Abraham, all those verses earlier in chapter 12 where he says, Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I'm going to give you this land, and it's going to be yours. If, without knowing the story, if I were to be like, hey, how do you think God's going to do that? You would think, well, I bet Abraham's going to have a lot of kids, and they're going to just start overpopulating the land, and eventually it'll be theirs. But Abraham only has one kid, Isaac. And Isaac only has 2. And the kid of the promise ends up leaving the land for 20 years. And if there's one thing that you see here in the text, and that we've seen time and time again, is that there are moments in life where if we were to be really honest, it seems like God doesn't know what he's doing. He certainly isn't handling the thing the way we would. And I imagine that there are probably some of you right now, and this is your life. You're looking at your life and you're just asking, I don't understand what God is doing. I don't understand how this makes any sense. This doesn't seem like, this is definitely not how I would do it. And if that's where you are, I would just give you maybe just a few thoughts. The first is this, as you're just maybe wrestling, and as you think about God's promises, something to remember is that they're not always linear. There is a way that we would do things. If we made that promise to Abraham, we probably would have tried to handle it differently. That when we make promises, we tend to try to handle it differently, but that's not how God's promises work. That his promises are bigger. Even when you just think about the promise that God made to Abraham, that there's only like a small portion of Israel's history where they inhabit the whole land, and it's during David and Solomon. And that truthfully, that promise that God made to Abraham, it's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And the land is heaven. So just imagine like explaining that to Jacob in the moment. Like that would be very difficult to understand, but that's how it works. The other thing I would say too is that one of the reasons why we struggle with God's timing or what God's doing is that we're so concerned with our comfort. And we just assume, well, since I am not comfortable, something must be off. When sometimes what God does is he brings us through uncomfortable situations to help teach us things that we need to learn. And maybe that's what he's doing in your circumstance. Maybe he's teaching you something through your discomfort that you need to see. Another thing, if that's what you're walking through, I would just remind you this, and I hate that this is true, but God never promises that what we go through is going to make sense. Sometimes God graciously allows that. We all probably have moments in our life where we went through something in time, and we look back on it and we're like, okay, I see what he was doing, but that's not a promise that he's made. That in heaven it will make sense, but in this life we're not guaranteed that. And in heaven, we might not even care to know because we'll just be happy to be in heaven. And for us, that's what you have to do when you're walking through discomfort, is you have to remind yourself that you do know how the story ends. And that the story ends with you and God together forever in heaven. And that what we know about heaven is that it says that the challenges that we face in this life, they will seem light and momentary compared to the glory that we experience with him. And so if you're walking through something, anchor your heart there. And that'll help you get through. So the first thing we see is that God's promises, they don't always seem, they seem kind of flimsy, but they're not. They just seem that way at times. The second observation from the text I would make is this, is that time with God changed Jacob. That time with God changed Jacob. I don't know if you have anybody in your life where, like when you spend time with them, like you're just like, man, that was good. Like I was with that person and I'm immediately refreshed. Like I feel good because I was with them. I was thinking about Pastor Scotty Gibbons was here last week, and we brought him out because he's a great preacher. At the end of us, like just kind of we're talking after the 11 o'clock service, just sitting on the stage talking about what God's doing in the church and just some stuff in my life. And man, I tell you what, he said something to me, and it was so significant that I ruminated on the whole drive to Nebraska after service. Like it was just, I just kept thinking about what he said. It was one of those moments where, God spoke to him or to me through him. And I'm like, man, I needed that as I head into this next season of life. Like, I just feel like that's what God wanted me to hear. And man, that's Scotty and that's me. And he's come out once every 6 or 7 years. So that's all I get. But the beauty of God is that we have access to him all the time. That you can always press into what he has for you. That you can always get to a place where, hey, I want to experience this. And as we look at Jacob, that he was the way he faced his fear with his brother was different after he encountered the presence of God. And I'll show you. It's really simple. If you look at verse 32 or chapter 32, this happened before he encountered his brother. That Jacob told his family, he's like, okay, the servants go in the front, Leah goes the second, and then Rachel behind there, and I'm going to just cover, I'm going to sit in the back, okay? And it says, your servant Jacob is behind us. He's thinking, if they get attacked, my best shot to make it is just stay in the back. Real strong person, you know what I mean? Like I can get behind this guy. But then if you notice, after he encounters the presence of God, he's different. Look at what he does in verse 3, chapter 33, verse 3. It says, he himself went before them. So he went from saying, I'm going to be in the back, to, no, I'm going to go up front. Because after spending time with God, I realized that God is going to take care of me. That I'm going to have a different type of confidence in approaching my brother. And the only thing that changed was time in the presence of God. And for us, that's how it works. That time in the presence of God, it has this ability to change us. And for all of, we have to be asking ourselves, okay, so what am I doing to put myself in those situations where his presence can change me? And there's all kinds of ways that we do this. One of the obvious, and you're here, is coming to church. There's something about what we do where we believe, this is why we do it every week, is because we believe there's something about the presence of God that is transformational. And it's not that he's not everywhere, but there's something about when we're together and we're talking about the Bible, that the Bible is sharper than any double-edged sword, that it has the power to transform us. And so that's what we do. We believe that happens. We believe even with worship. We know that God is omnipresent, that he's everywhere. But there's something about singing to him and focusing on what you're saying that makes you aware of the fact that he's here in the room too. But it's not just being here. And for all of us, it's worth asking this. Am I coming to church because I'm American and it's Sunday? Or am I coming to church because I want God's presence to transform me? And that has a lot to do with your engagement in these moments. Are you looking for places to serve? That'll transform you. That during worship, are you thinking about what we're singing, thinking about God's presence, or are you thinking about the parts of the songs you don't like? That when I get up here to talk, are you trying to engage and listen to what I'm saying, or are you pulling out your phone every couple of minutes to see what's going on online? There's an intentionality that comes with being in his presence. It starts here, but it's not just here. There's also this, he's everywhere. And so that means that every day you have access to him. Every day you have access to his word. Every day he's just one prayer away. And it's worth asking, are we taking advantage of what's available to us, which is his presence that he wants to give you? Even as I think about something like camp, when we've got the staff that has the shirts on, and we look like we're starting a cult. And that's a couple years from now. But we're going off to camp, and it's why do camp? Well, it's because we know that time in the presence of God transforms people's lives. It's so important to me that my kids go. And as I pray for them, it's because I know that there are going to be opportunities where they're going to be alone with the presence of God. Not alone, but they're going to be in a room. Just walk in the woods, kid, we'll find, not that. But there'll be opportunities for them to just have moments and experiences with God that can transform their lives and impact their stories. I was a youth pastor for a decade. And what I can tell you is there's something special about camp. That you get away and just you and God. And I've seen kids whose lives have been changed forever because of, and it's not the camp, it's the presence of God. It's making yourself available to that. And it's something that's available to all of us. That what time with God does is it gives us confidence because we trust his promises in a new way. That what time with God does is it humbles us because it helps us see who we are in relation to him. That it changes us, but we have to realize too that there are special moments in our lives where God will grab our hearts. And we did nothing, it was just he just grabbed me. And it's I know he's talking to me, I know that's what's going on. But I think the longer that you do it, you've got to be more intentional. You got to press in, you got to make it a priority. And as you do, what you'll find is you'll go from the back of the group to the front. I was praying about this message on Friday, and I really felt like I needed to say this, that maybe there's some of you here, and there's something in front of you, and you're afraid. You're afraid to face it. And I really feel like what God wants you to hear is that you haven't prioritized time in his presence enough. And that's why you're afraid. That you haven't been intentional with spending time with him, and that's why you're so afraid of that circumstance. And what he wants you to do is he wants you to be more intentional about what you're what you're doing to experience him, and if you do, I think that will subside your fears quite a bit. So time with God, it changed Jacob, and then finally we see this. So we see that partial obedience is disobedience and dangerous. Okay, so partial obedience is disobedience and dangerous. And this is one of those texts where it is a partial obedience text. First you got Esau, okay, and we'll look at that first map of Esau there with the weird-looking rectangle and the square. Now, Esau could have been like, I'm not in the land, but I'm close. We're basically like touching. Arkansas is basically Missouri, right? He could have been like, I could have gone all the way to Egypt, but I stayed close. But the truth is, he wasn't in the place where God wanted him to be. He could have come up with all these reasons why that was the case, but he wasn't where he was supposed to be. But probably the most dangerous part, and we'll lean into this next week, is Jacob's partial obedience in the text. And his partial obedience in the text is why next week is rated R. Let me just show you. I'll show you this first verse. It says this in verse 18. It doesn't seem like much. It says, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem. Doesn't seem like much, but he wasn't supposed to go to Shechem. He was supposed to go to Bethel. And we know that because when Jacob left the land for the first time, God said this to him, and this was how it went. In chapter 28, verses 15 and verse 19, it says this, God speaking. He says, behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. Verse 19, and he called the name of that place Bethel. He was supposed to go to Bethel. And then you see even beyond that after the incident that happens next week that we're going to look at, this is what God says to Jacob. In chapter 35, verse 1, he says this. He says, arise, go to Bethel, meaning he wasn't supposed to go to Shechem. Okay, you're like, why does that even matter? Well, let me show you this map. Okay, that this map is another map of the land, and here is what you see that is so fascinating. Shechem is 20 miles away from Bethel. Meaning, he traveled 1,000 miles to get to the land that he was supposed to go. He had 20 more, and he would have been right where God wanted him to be. But instead, he stayed where he wasn't. And man, is that not us? He could have said, I was in the land. It's 20 miles away. What's the big deal? But here's the thing when it comes to God. God's not looking for close. He's looking for obedience. You're not looking for close with your kids. You're looking for obedience. And as much as you might tell yourself it isn't that big of a deal, no, partial obedience is disobedience, and what we're going to see next week is that it can be very, very dangerous. And I would just point this out as I close, that this is one of the reasons why I love talking about Jacob. Okay? Because if Jacob has this encounter with God where they wrestle and he gets the limp, and moving forward, he's just like, good. That's really hard to preach on, because that sets us up for something that none of us can do. But the cool thing with Jacob is that he's so much like us. He had this incredible encounter with God, changed him, and that even though it changed him, he still kept falling. He still was partially obedient. He still didn't always do what he's supposed to do. And what that shows us is it shows us that we too will never be able to always do what we're supposed to do, and that we need someone, that since God is holy, we need someone to go before us to him if we're ever going to have any hope. And I love the way that Peter says it in his letter in the New Testament. He says it this way, talking about Jesus. He says, he committed no sin. Talking about Jesus. Neither was deceit found in his mouth, meaning that if he says he's going to Seir, he's going to Seir. And when he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. And when he suffered, he didn't threaten. but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. That Jesus wasn't our example, but Jesus was our substitute. Meaning that when you put your faith in him, you're acknowledging that you're like Jacob, that you need someone to be perfect. And the only person that can be perfect for you is Jesus. He lived a perfect life. And when you put your trust in him, when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin and all the times you got it wrong. But when God looks at you, he sees his son. Let's pray. God, we love you. God, we're thankful for who you are. God, we're thankful for what you do. Jesus, we are grateful that we can put our hope in you. That God, that you're not our example that would crush us because we couldn't live up to that. But the truth is, God, you are our substitute. That God, you go before us in a way that when your Father looks, he doesn't see our sins, but he sees his son. And I just pray this morning, God, if there's anyone here who has not been transformed by that reality, who hasn't put their trust in that reality, maybe there's someone watching online, I pray, God, by the power of your Spirit, that you would make them aware of their need to know you and experience you. And then, God, I just pray for my friends in this room. And I pray maybe there are people here and they don't understand what you're doing. I pray that you would bring them comfort and bring them peace. God, maybe there are people here and the truth is that, that they need to spend some time in your presence to be able to face what's coming their way confidently. God, maybe there are people here and they've been partially obedient, patting themselves on the back for almost doing what you said. And I just pray that you would help them to see, God, that is not what you ask for. Jesus, we love you and we thank you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. Love you guys.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us for Service Online today.
And if you feel called to give at New Life, there's two different ways you can do so. You can text the number 84321 with the amount that you would like to give, or you can go online to giving.nlspringfield.com.
And we would love to see you here at New Life in person sometime. And when you're here in person, the best way to connect with us is at Party with the Pastor. It is the first Sunday of every month, and it is a party. We've got games, snacks, giveaways, and you'll get to know New Life just a little bit better.
We would love to see you in person. We have services at 8, 9:30, and 11. We would love it if you would join us.